Foreign, the ERS in the region executed hundreds of residents in March 1968. Between 1965 and 1973, the United States faced a grueling war against the communist forces of North Vietnam. This conflict was characterized as an extremely violent guerrilla war, in which young American soldiers were sent to fight in distant lands against an enemy that employed tactics vastly different from those the U.S. was accustomed to facing. To this day, what American soldiers witnessed in the Vietnam War remains controversial. Some argue that the war was a legitimate action to protect South Vietnam from communist aggression coming from the North. Others, however, contend that it was an unjustifiable intervention by the United States, driven by an exaggerated fear of communism during the Cold War. What is undeniable is that this conflict resulted in the deaths of millions of people, many of whom were civilians killed by American forces. Among the deaths caused by the U.S., none were more brutal and notorious than the massacre that occurred on March 16th. This 1968 massacre claimed the lives of 504 innocent civilians, including foreign women and children. At that time, the United States was facing significant difficulties in Vietnam. The Tet Offensive, launched by the North Vietnamese in January 1968, had significantly weakened American military strength and shaken the country's morale, both abroad and at home. Seeking to regain the upper hand in the war, the U.S. launched a series of counteroffensives to try to contain the communist advance. One of the main targets of this campaign was the province of Quang Ngai, specifically the village of Sun Mi. This village consisted of several smaller hamlets, including Corpo a Corpo. To simplify, we will use the most widely known name for the area, Mila. Mila was nicknamed Pinkville by American soldiers due to its apparent sympathy for the Viet Cong and was considered a strategic point for communist resistance. U.S. intelligence claimed that the Viet Cong was actively operating in that region, making the village an important communist outpost. In March 1968, Task Force Barker was assembled with the goal of neutralizing local resistance. This force was composed of soldiers from two main units, Company C, belonging to the 20th Battalion's 1st Italian Infantry Regiment, and Company B, part of the 3rd Infantry Regiment of the 11th Brigade of the 23rd Infantry Division. For simplicity, we will refer to them as Company B and Company C. Additionally, there was Company A, which played a minor role in the events. Company C was under the command of Captain Ernest Medina, with Lieutenant William Kelly as his second in command. This battalion arrived in Vietnam in December 1967, and although it had not yet participated in direct combat, had already lost 28 soldiers due to landmine explosions and booby traps in March 1968. On the 15th of that month, Company C organized a memorial to honor a highly respected sergeant who had been killed the day before. The soldiers were furious, frustrated, and eager for revenge. That night, they would find a way to take it. Task Force Barker was ordered to attack Corpo a Corpo the following morning. The plan was for Company C to enter the village directly, while Company B would secure a nearby hamlet. Company A would be positioned to intercept any Viet Cong fighters attempting to escape. During the briefing, Captain Medina informed the soldiers that they would be facing intense communist resistance and would be outnumbered 2-1. He also mentioned that at 7 a.m., the village's civilians would be leaving their homes to go to the market, meaning that anyone remaining should be considered an enemy. There is no consensus on exactly what was said during this briefing. Some soldiers claim that Medina was asked how they should proceed if they encountered women and children. According to reports, the orders were to eliminate anyone suspected of being involved with the combatants. One soldier stated that Medina commanded, "They are all Viet Cong now. Go and get them." Another reported that Medina instructed them that anyone running, hiding, or appearing suspicious should be eliminated. If a man runs, shoot him. If a woman with a weapon runs, shoot her too. As disturbing as this may sound, this mindset was not uncommon. Many soldiers and observers noted that violence against civilians was a routine occurrence among American troops. During the Vietnam War, body counts were used as the primary metric to measure the success of operations. The higher the death toll, the more effective a unit was considered within the military hierarchy. As a result, civilians were often counted among the enemy dead. Regardless of the exact words spoken in the briefing, the soldiers clearly understood the message. Rifleman Bernardo Simpson, recalling the moment years later, knew precisely what the order was. We were told to leave nothing standing. We did what we were told, regardless of whether they were civilians or not. On the morning of March 16th, at 7:24 a.m., the operation began. The tranquility of the Vietnamese countryside was abruptly interrupted by artillery fire. The bombing struck the civilian population by surprise, leaving the residents stunned and defenseless. Between 7:30 and 7:37 a.m., Company C landed in the village of Mila, transported by helicopters. Nearby, an aerial team identified 4 individuals suspected of being combatants and attacked them before they could approach the village. These would be the only possible enemies encountered by American soldiers throughout the day. Military intelligence had failed. Not only were there no combatants in the area, but only one weapon was found in the entire village. Additionally, the civilians had not gone to the market as expected. Still shaken by the bombing, the residents received the American soldiers with distrust. The military quickly gathered the inhabitants, grouping them in different parts of the village. Apparently, the residents of Mila did not realize that something was about to happen. The accounts of the following events vary, but according to some versions, without any warning, an American soldier attacked a civilian with a bayonet. Like predators drawn to the smell of blood, the other soldiers quickly followed suit. Gunfire erupted. Desperate screams echoed through the village. The massacre had begun. The American soldiers showed no mercy. They threw grenades into shelters to kill civilians trying to hide, shot at anyone they encountered, stabbed people with bayonets, and set houses on fire with their victims still inside. Women begged for their lives, screaming that they were not Viet Cong, but their pleas were ignored. One soldier reported seeing mothers throwing themselves over their children to protect them, but that did not stop the military from shooting the parents and then executing the children. The Americans even used grenade launchers against groups of civilians to make the massacre more efficient. Meanwhile, Company B landed in another nearby village, approximately 45 minutes after Company C arrived. Although less documented, their actions followed the same pattern, resulting in the deaths of between 60 and 155 people over the following hours. In one of the most brutal episodes, a group of between 20 and 50 civilians was led to a dirt road on the outskirts of Mila and executed en masse. One of the witnesses to this horror was Sergeant Ronald Heberly, a photographer for the U.S. Army. He had been officially sent to document the operation, but, horrified by what he saw, also used his personal camera to capture the scenes. His photos would later become crucial evidence in exposing the massacre. Some of the most impactful images show terrified civilians tied up moments before being killed. Others reveal the bodies of women and children sprawled across the ground after the slaughter. Heberly never forgot the sight of a wounded boy wandering in confusion. The child had already been shot in the arm and leg. When Heberly knelt down to photograph him, an American soldier approached and fired 3 shots, killing the child before walking away. Among the main figures responsible for the massacre was Lieutenant William Kelly, second in command of Company C. Many soldiers stated that he was the one who gave the direct orders to open fire on the civilians. Kelly gathered between 70 and 80 villagers and led them to an irrigation ditch east of the settlement. There, he ordered his men to execute them. Kelly himself set his rifle to automatic fire and did not stop shooting until everyone was dead. Rape was also a prevalent crime during the massacre. At least 20 women and girls were raped, though the actual number was likely much higher. One of the most horrific cases involved a woman who was attacked right after a soldier had murdered her children. The massacre lasted for several hours. One of the soldiers, Specialist Bernardo Simpson, later claimed to have personally killed or mutilated 25 people. Another soldier compared the events to the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. Some soldiers chose not to participate in the attacks, but no member of Company C attempted to stop the killings. Throughout the entire massacre, only one shot was fired at an American soldier, and that shot came from one of their own men, who deliberately shot himself in the foot to be removed from the combat zone. For some, this was a genuine effort to avoid committing war crimes. For others, it was merely a cowardly way to escape without trying to stop the slaughter. However, 3 soldiers stood out for their courage and humanity. A helicopter crew, consisting of Officer Hugh Thompson Jr., Specialist Lawrence Colburn, and Specialist Glenn Andreatta, was horrified by what they saw and attempted to intervene to protect the civilians. They spotted a wounded woman trying to escape. The helicopter crew radioed for assistance but received no response. In an attempt to protect her, they launched a smoke grenade to provide cover. However, they could only watch as Captain Medina approached and, without hesitation, executed her at point-blank range. Later, Thompson saw American soldiers marching toward a bunker where civilians were hiding. Without hesitation, he landed his helicopter between the soldiers and the shelter, positioning himself as a barrier to prevent more deaths. Leading the approaching troops was none other than Lieutenant Kelly. Desperate, Thompson pleaded with him to stop the massacre. Thompson tried to persuade Kelly to allow the civilians to escape, but Kelly refused, claiming that it would be better to kill them. Faced with the gravity of the situation, Thompson decided to act on his own and began evacuating the civilians with the help of his team. The helicopter gunner, Specialist Colburn, received a clear instruction. If any American soldier attempted to stop the rescue, he should open fire. However, no one tried to interfere. Together, they managed to save approximately a dozen civilians. During the rescue operation, Specialist Glenn Andreatta even threw himself into an irrigation ditch full of bodies to save a 4-year-old child who miraculously was unharmed. Although they had managed to save some lives, the victory felt hollow amid the destruction around them. Estimates for the number of victims varied. The Vietnamese government reported 504 dead, while American records indicated 347. The vast majority were women and children. Among them, at least 17 women were pregnant, and 56 of the children were infants. As for the men, almost half were over 60 years old, and the rest were mostly elderly or too frail to pose any threat. Only 4 suspected Viet Cong combatants were killed, and they were all outside the village. Upon returning to base, Thompson and his crew immediately reported the events to their superiors. It was a massacre, Thompson told his captain. They are rounding up civilians, placing them in ditches, and simply executing them. The reports moved up the chain of command until they reached Colonel Orrin Henderson. Henderson quickly interviewed Thompson. However, any hope for justice was soon dashed. The official report from Task Force Barker claimed that 128 Viet Cong combatants had been killed, without mentioning the civilian casualties. In the end, military command chose to support the official version. Even after hearing Thompson's testimony, Henderson recommended Captain Medina for a promotion. Less than 2 weeks after the massacre, General William Westmoreland, commander of the U.S. Military Assistance Command in Vietnam, MACV, sent a congratulatory message to Company C. The military press enthusiastically highlighted the unit's victory over a supposedly Viet Cong-occupied village. However, not everyone believed the official narrative. An initial investigation conducted by the Army itself concluded that about 20 civilians had been accidentally killed, allegedly due to the initial bombing. Meanwhile, soldiers from Company C openly boasted about the hundreds of executions. One of those who became aware of the reports was Specialist Ron Reidenauer. Days later, while flying over Mila, he saw that the ditches were still filled with corpses. Despite this, it took months for any action to be taken. At the end of 1968, Tom Glenn sent a letter to military authorities denouncing an epidemic of violence against civilians in Vietnam. Although he did not directly mention Mila, the massacre appeared to be part of a broader pattern of brutality by U.S. forces. The Army then assigned an officer to conduct an investigation, a young lieutenant named Colin Powell. By late 1968, Powell quickly concluded that the accusations were exaggerated. This same Colin Powell would later become the U.S. Secretary of State under the Bush administration, playing a key role in the War on Terror. It became increasingly evident that the military was trying to cover up the massacre. However, upon leaving the Army, Ron Ridenour joined the growing group of voices calling for an investigation. He sent dozens of letters exposing the events to President Nixon, the Pentagon, and at least 30 congressmen. None of them responded publicly. Still, the Army could no longer ignore the fact that civilians had been murdered in My La. In September 1969, they formally charged only Lieutenant Kelly, holding him accountable for 6 murders. The story might have been buried if not for journalist Seymour Hersh. Already aware of the suspicions surrounding My La, Hersh published a bombshell article on November 13, 1969, exposing the massacre and the military trial against Kelly. In the following weeks, Sergeant Heberly, the photographer who had documented the operation, shared his images with Life and Time magazines. The photos were undeniable proof. American soldiers had massacred hundreds of Vietnamese civilians and attempted to cover up the crime. The revelations shocked the public and further eroded trust in the war. The Nixon administration, led by National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, tried to contain the damage but failed. By the end of the year, CBS was already broadcasting interviews with soldiers who had participated in the massacre. Some soldiers openly admitted their participation in the massacre. However, for many people, it was difficult to accept that American troops could have committed something so brutal. A survey conducted among Minnesota residents indicated that 49% believed the story was false, created by anti-war activists with the intent of defaming the military. Faced with increasing pressure, the Army was forced to conduct an official investigation. Lieutenant General William Pierce was appointed to lead it. His report, released in March 1970, concluded that at least 200 civilians had been killed, while the maximum number of identified Viet Cong combatants was only 4. Pierce classified the event as a tragedy of immense proportions. In total, 26 soldiers were formally charged, a very small number considering the total number of those involved. 4 officers, including Kelly, and 9 soldiers faced charges directly related to the massacre, while another 12 were indicted for covering it up. However, out of the 25 accused, only 5 went to trial. Of those, 4 were acquitted. On March 29, 1971, Lieutenant William Kelly was sentenced to life in prison for murdering at least 22 innocent civilians. He was the only one convicted for the My La massacre. During the trial, Kelly showed no remorse. To him, he was simply following orders. He remained convinced that the people of My La were his enemies. If I had to choose between my life and that of the enemy, I would always protect my soldiers. That was the only mistake I made, he declared. Reactions to the sentence were mixed. Many still believed Kelly was innocent, while others saw his actions as justified. A Gallup poll revealed that 79% of the population disagreed with his life sentence, and a significant portion believed he should not have been tried at all. Shortly after, President Richard Nixon intervened and changed his sentence to house arrest. In 1974, Kelly received a full pardon, serving only 3.5 years of his original sentence. Meanwhile, the heroic actions of Thompson, Colburn, and Andreatta were ignored for a long time. Initially, the Army awarded Thompson the Distinguished Flying Cross for rescuing civilians in a combat zone, while the other 2 received the Bronze Star. However, the official citation for Thompson's medal distorted the events, attempting to downplay the massacre. Outraged, he discarded the medal. Andreatta was killed in combat later that same year and never received recognition for his role in My La. Only in 1998, 3 decades after the massacre, were Thompson and Colburn finally awarded the Soldier's Medal, the highest honor given by the U.S. Army for heroic acts outside of combat. Andreatta was awarded the medal posthumously. Thompson and Colburn even visited My La and met some of the people they had saved that day. However, the emotional scars of the massacre remained. Thompson suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder for the rest of his life due to the horrors he had witnessed. The My Lai massacre became a symbol of the Vietnam War. It showed the world that the United States was just as capable of committing atrocities as the enemies they claimed to fight against. It also raised broader questions about the overall conduct of the war. Over time, other soldiers came forward, stating that My Lai had not been an isolated case. One sergeant even declared that there was a My Lai every month for over a year. What is already known about My Lai is horrifying enough, but the most unsettling question remains: how many other similar massacres happened without ever being discovered?